Guys, I'm back here with Brian Foley, and he just wrote a really compelling piece around how you can really understand the stage that you're in as you're progressing as a fitness athlete. And what he's trying to do with it is to have a better framework of understanding for progressing somebody through a fairly understood number of stages. So if he knows that you're going to go through stage 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, he can help you get there and then get to the next stage over and over and over in a more predictable way, which when we were talking before we started the show, he's trying to sort of bring order to chaos, if you will, in this whole thing called fitness sports. So Brian, do us a favor and explain to us what this concept is. And actually, I'm really curious how you kind of came up with this.
Yeah, so starting off, this was how I came up with this was an accumulation of not only my experiences, but a time in my life to where I'm in a transition of being able to conceptualize and have a perception of everything I did in sport as now from a seasoned, I'd say, from a better point of view with more wisdom, right? And a coaching lens, you can call that in simple terms. And so it allowed me to sit here and go, okay, well, we all have a starting point, right? And you had mentioned this earlier in our talk of how it's every athlete goes through this, to where when you start out, there's the do's and don'ts. There's this essentially chaos that is dropped onto you and you're inspired to pursue this journey. But the reason why you're going down this is to learn, because it's the unknowable of like, okay, what do I do? So, going and actually walking this path through competitive fitness, there's this magic that starts to happen through, once you get organized in your training, you start to establish these goals, and then you're able to, over time, be able to build your own vision, right? And be able to actually see what's going to be coming into your future and manifest those things. I think that in order for someone to be able to get to that point, right, you're going to have to find these stages. And like I mentioned earlier, it's unconscious. And I think where this model comes into play and I think is important is that I think all of us have gone through this. If we've been through that journey, we just didn't know how to word it.
So could you do us a favor and almost in bullet point format, just to give context, what are the stages? What would you consider the stages?
Yeah, so I put 5, and you actually mentioned this on putting a timeline, kind of, where does this sit for each person in the stage? And I actually put a lot of thought to that and going like, wow, this is a hard question, Jim, because this is, I'm coming up with this model, but it's like, I actually don't know, because someone could go through these stages very fast, right? But, going through my own experience and my experiences with my clients, I find that it comes down to amount of sessions. And the amount of sessions that we can put in as humans today kind of correlates to the same time frame for us, right? So really it comes down to, are you doing singles or doubles? In very black and white terms here. And seeing that it took me 5 years to actually get to a point that I thought was going to take 2 in my athletic venture. And if someone told me it was going to take 5, I would have been like, no fucking way. That's not going to happen. It's not going to take me 5 years to get to where I need to go, because I thought I was already at, really for myself, I look at my stages that I'm looking at on my paper here. I thought I was probably already at stage 5 coming into the sport competitively. And so getting a little sidetracked there on the question, just kind of going down these rabbit holes. Yeah, so the bullet points with this is, 5 stages. I sum this up to 5 years because, again, this was my experience. It took me 5 years to get to the stage I wanted to. The stage I wanted to was a lot bigger than what I actually got to. But I then realized, wow, this is what it took to go from 0 to 1, right? And this is where this model framework comes into play. And this stages are for someone that, from 0 stage 1 and being a builder, it's a beginner. Right? So this is someone that's just starting this journey. It could be individual design. It could be towards this sport of fitness. And they have no idea where to start. So this is where they're going to end up. And I believe with structure and organization through that chaos, within a 4 to 5 year period, if you're going from 0 and trying to go to 1, you're going to establish yourself as a functioning athlete that's going to be able to somewhat have aspirations to participate, within that sport. So bullet points there. So beginners, your first year, you're learning, the do's and don'ts. You're just figuring things out, getting into having more experience in time, which really is how many sessions you're putting into your entire year, right? You start to develop this one with your training, and you now want to achieve, you want to now achieve your own things, your own goals, your own perceptions, rather than being like, okay, I'm just going to follow this blog, or I'm going to follow this route to nowhere that I believe that at some point I can just take a pit stop and get off on the freeway, and then I'm right here to the show. When really that's on autopilot for nobody, right? So you're going to no man's land. And so when you start to get to the stage of achieving, right, I think this is where it gets, there's a switch that happens to where you start believing you have control of what your outcomes are going to be within your training. And I think that's where the two, right, there's a highlight in there. It's, in the words in that article, is there's magic in the stage and you will feel it when you are there. And that's what I'm talking about, is that you just embody it. You just take ownership and you're like, you know what? I want to achieve something bigger than me. It's not about trying to find a direction or the purpose of what I'm doing. It's like, I'm going to find these tangible targets for myself to get me to point B. And then I think through that, you're able to really transcend yourself into stage 3, which is growing. And I think that's a longer period for people, because you're learning not only about what you're trying to accomplish, but you're actually learning a lot about yourself. I would say identifying as a person and as a human. And there's a lot of truths that can come out of you through your training and these growing stages, and you getting up to these challenges that you never thought you would ever be up against. And, you know, always rising to the occasion, or putting yourself through these torturous mental workouts, right? There's so many examples that we could dive into in the growing stage. I think what happens is then you start going through this growing stage, and then you're able to formulate who you are, right? And when you know who you are, and you know your mission, and you have that destination, you are going to thrive. And that's where I like that fourth stage, you're thriving, you're going, it's competition mode. I am on automatic mode. I am no longer asking questions. My questions are, what do I need to do before this date? Right? Okay, cool. Am I on the right track? Yes? Great. Good to go. I have guidance over my shoulder, whether that be a coach. And then depending on, 5, we'll say mastering your training. I would say that at my stage and my age and my experience, I was able to master certain aspects of my training. I think I now have an entire cycle to relive myself, to go back to figuring out how do I refine and master my own training again. Maybe that being outside of like a competitive atmosphere. So yeah, I think the stage 5 is really cool to see. And I think that's just when I'm speaking from a coach's lens right now, is I think if you were to work with an athlete and they got to stage 5 and put this in a bullet point and what the goal is on that, it's to have them not need you anymore. And I think that's transcending the athlete, right? And kind of just going through my little speech here, I'd say that the whole idea there is to transcend the athlete. It's not to transcend anybody else but yourself that's going through this and going, wow, actually, I think I'm at stage 2 right now. And I didn't even know there were stages. And it gives you this, these chunks and these benchmarks and these carrots to chase.
How often, based on these stages, would you see somebody perhaps change a goal or go down a different pathway? Because what seems to me is somebody might want to go down 5 stages as a fitness athlete, and then they might get to stage 2 and they're like, I don't know about this. I'm not sure if that's what I really want to do. I mean, is this malleable in a way where people could either find a different goal or find solace in a different path?
Yeah, I think this is a good way. Well, we'll say a structured way or an organized way to have someone find their truth faster, right? Like you're saying that really what these stages do, it's just slowing down your path and allowing you to just, like I said, reusing that phrase, slowing down and having a different perspective here and going, okay, like I mentioned earlier to you, it's a good point to plug in. When I told you I went down the path, like I'm going to go to the fucking CrossFit Games, right? And it was 2011, whenever I was watching them online. Like, I could do this. I saw the weights, how much they weighed. I weighed the same. And then I have this path, right? Not once did I ever put my head up and go, how long is this actually going to take me? I just went down in it, right? And then I chipped away here. But now, like I had said, if someone told me prior, Brian, you're going to have to do 5 years of this. I think, honestly, if that was the case back then, I still would have done the route. But I would have had so much more shit on my brain and my thought process of what was going on or what my day-to-day actions were actually going to get me to, because I'd be thinking about a lot more outside of, just my goal and my task of winning. And then I guess this is me personally, I start thinking about life a little bit more. Right. So I think that's where, given the person in the scenario, and just should they be conscious or unconscious is the important part, right? Because if you're unconscious and you're laser focused, I would say, and you're trying to be a champion, it's probably the best scenario you're going to be in, because you're not focused on anything else. But for those who need it and need to have something slowed down to give them the right path, I would call it, to allow them to get clarity and truth of like, you know what, this is really cool, but after doing 2 years of this organized training and I have this system in my place, like I'm actually going to go pursue left. And when you said that to me, Jim, I had 10 clients through my head just go, that one did it. This happened to this person, this person, this person. At that time, it was more of like, well, this is shitty, because you kind of led them to a path away from you in a sense. But at the end of the day, you can look at all those people and be like, wow, they did the right choice for them, which is pretty cool.
Well, and also too, just because the pathway shifts doesn't mean that there isn't a pathway.
Right.
So lots of people might shift the North Star, if you will, but that still means that they're taking steps forward to go achieve that next North Star. I think that that's something that's fairly consistent amongst not only Big Dogs coaches, but also Big Dogs athletes, is that, they're growers. They want to improve. They want to progress. It doesn't always have to be to one specific goal, which is, I think, really interesting. Kind of what it makes me think about when you talk about that progression is that it helps somebody think about their timeline, which, to your point on being unconscious, let's look at, I don't know, Chinese weightlifters or whatever. They know that they're going to compete around August, 4 years from now. They might be unconscious in their daily training, but they know what the goal is. They know what they're trying to win.
Right.
And so I think that there's some powerful truth behind the notion that it's at least beneficial to have something bigger in your brain, and then you can go autopilot when you show up and just, kill things, if,
Right.
to use a term.
Yeah.
So I think that's really fascinating. I appreciate you bringing this up. I want to keep the conversation short enough. So if you haven't read the rest of the article, read the rest of the article. We'll link to it, underneath. And then, also this will be embedded in the blog itself. But there's a lot of cool things there. Ask yourself where you really sit in these stages and be honest, because there's a lot that you can learn about it. And like Brian said, the better your expectation is, the better your biggest progression is probably going to be. So Brian, thanks for coming on, man. I really appreciate it. We'll see you next time.
Absolutely. Thanks.